they're all quite interesting, actually, and probably relatively obvious, but in fact, as with sight before, our intuitions are not necessarily as accurate as the statistics would suggest. But just those four things. Successive pictures are usually close to each other. So, for example, here we're about to set off the alarm, I'm sure. If I move upwards like that, your expectation of what might happen is probably that it's something nearby rather than somewhere down this way. The pictures tend to move towards a certain point. If I've moved up there, you may eventually think that something's going to come down. It's going to go somewhere lower than it was before. Large intervals, then we tend to fall down. And finally, melodic phrases tend to exhibit an arch-like content, not unlike our picture of Lake Thun before. But I think what's interesting is also some of the other factors influencing emotional response in music. We heard in the rhythm before, when we were enlivened, we had a beat that was repetitive, that was that we could therefore connect with, and therefore made us probably feel quite comfortable. Most of us, I noticed, when Charles was playing the music before, tended to be moving some of our body. There was some sort of reaction going on. So we're hearing something, but we want our bodies to move with it. We actually talk about movements in music and so on. The relationship of the timbre to expectations. Normally, our expectation when you hear an opening timbre is that the music will stay consistent with that timbre, and that subtle timbre changes will not necessarily go noticed by people unless they're really familiar with the style or perhaps familiar with the music. Another one, the relationship of voice to meaning. I want to take some very short excerpts of music from tonight's concert. Just listen to 3 short excerpts, and what does the sound of the music, what's the sonority of the instrument you're going to hear, which will be 2 different voices singing the same phrase of music, and an oboe playing a slightly different piece. I just want you to listen to these 3 sonorities and see what sort of you discover subconsciously you think about the music as a consequence of what you hear. So, as part of the advertisement for a concert later on, the auditorium over in the concert hall is world class, and this one isn't. In terms of sonority, we'll just at least get an idea of. I can find my pedal. No, I'll have to shout from here, but we'll get feedback. No, let's just in here. So I'm going to do your phrase first, and then your phrase sentence at the start of the song. And, sorry, yes, let's try that. I think it'll set it off. But. Now, just one more, just a similar sort of range of pitch, but Bernie's here. Yeah, have you got an oboe out? Yeah. An instrumental sonority that is obviously derived from the voice that actually creates a very different sense. We're really working in the same pitch range, as I say, but the sonorities, I would argue, of the three pieces, although the melodic energies and the pitches are not that dissimilar, actually create a meaning in themselves, which I think is quite fascinating. But anyhow, you get to hear bits of all of that music in about 3/4 of an hour's time. Dynamic continuity, again, every piece I just played, you actually had the constant dynamic. If I suddenly went soft or loud, you really notice it, I hope. And obviously, you can hear little motivic ideas in each of those cells, and there's also the Brahms, which we will have to go and listen to later on. And also, we won't get into harmonic resolutions, but you have expectations because all your life you've been hearing music around you. If you've been playing Tetris, this is the moment for you. This idea of manipulating little patterns is obviously something that's really deeply immersed in us, and it happens in all composers. One of the things I think that's really interesting from a creative standpoint, though, is whether you're meant to recognize those patterns or whether we're meant to discover these patterns from the compositional perspective, but that they're working at a subliminal level when you get into the actual the music itself. Very quickly running through some issues to do with performance and communication. Essentially, one of the reasons we practice a lot is because we have to get our whole mechanisms to work so much faster than we can spontaneously, except in improvisation. And I think there's a really fascinating thing between improvisation and repertoire, because in the end, what one would want to do in repertoire-based playing in the ideal world is to be almost back into a state of improvisation. But it's a very complicated process to get to that stage, because it's very likely that a performer, by repeating, becomes much safer, therefore is not so scared of nature anymore, but at the same time is not so open to when the music moments come as surprises, and also that the complexity of how we're thinking probably leaves us in an introverted state, which is not so great for communication. So there's a few little problems in the musical context, which are not atypical of other contexts in the world. So the consequence is a challenge of generating this concept of a state of flow, which of course is a really fascinating concept, I think, from a cognitive perspective. Now, but from a performing perception, if you actually are really wanting to be conscious of these things, of trying to get people to breathe with your music, of trying to flow with your music, then perhaps you have to choreograph it so that the audience has a chance of being able to flow. I think most musical training has been focused on what I'm doing as the player, rather than what you need me to do as the listener. And there's probably a lot of work to be done to explore how we can improve communication so that you can connect with what we're trying to express. There have been some studies actually done by the Geneva Center where audiences are asked what their emotional response is to music that they hear. The performers always think that the results that they see are terrible. They've got nothing to do with what the performer was trying to project. They therefore blame the researcher or the audience, when obviously it seems to me that what we need to do is work on getting that the performers are able to communicate much more vividly the energies and intentions and emotions that they're trying to produce. And this concept of choreographing expectations is something from David Huron. Oops, sorry, yep, I'm nearly there. I'm just trying to get this thing to work. What do I have to do? There we are. Now, but what I think is also really interesting, in the moment of performance, my work is actually usually involved with other people. So the anticipation is of exactly what someone else is going to do in the same performing moment. So rather than the 4 bars followed by the 4 bars, I'm having to work out what this person is doing in the same phrase that I'm about to play. Of course we've rehearsed, but the creative flow is actually more open to spontaneous response than you might think as a listener. But it seems to me it's not unlike the dancing process. Look at the diversity of inputs that are coming when you're dancing. It's interesting, for example, that people looking at problems to do with dementia and so on. I think that ballroom dancing may be one of the things that can help you because of the variety of elements of the brain, if you like, that are lit up when one is involved in this sort of activity. For me, the relationship to the performance is very like this. You're trying to bring the past to the present. You're trying to bring the connection to the other person in terms of real sound. You're trying to relate to a composer. You're trying to relate to an audience. There's a lot of touching going on in real time. It doesn't work, though, if everyone's asleep. So there is this whole thing of what's going on in reception. We can be trying to communicate all sorts of things, but if your ambition is that music should be there to help you fall asleep, which is obviously a valid sort of proposition, then obviously we've got some disconnection going on here. And I think there's a whole... But on the other hand, if you're not in some sort of quasi-dream state when you listen, I think it's also difficult to know how we can get the connections to flow. There's a few things I think that come out of this. Brahms used to compose in summer but perform in winter. And if you look at it, you go back to one of the early pictures I have of someone drawing a phrase. People used to draw in caves many, many years ago, and as you saw, they played in flutes. There's a sense in which maybe this is like a fireside activity. It's a form of bringing conceptual warmth as we connect with each other. One of the cognitive things I think is really interesting is not just studying the individual brain, but actually the connections that occur between different people. And music is one example of that, but of course there's many, many examples of it, including the very fact we're in this room at this moment now. Right, very quickly to finish. What I think is really fascinating about this from a musical perspective, when I was 17, which is I gathered is roughly the mean age if I look across the room here, music was something you studied by looking, as I said, at repertoire, history and theory. I think the perspectives are changing. We look much more at improvisation than we used to. I think there's a lot to learn from understanding the cognitive mechanisms that are involved in playing, because what we're ultimately trying to do as performing musicians is communicate rather than recite lectures about history or theory. And there's a huge journey to be made through that, which I learn a lot from reading some of these other texts and so on. And yes, my focus is specifically in one area, but it's amazing the volume of texts that can help you quickly establish insights into these other fields. I have, though, a picture here by Leonardo. When I was 17, Leonardo was an artist. But these days, he's as often seen as a scientist. It's a change in perspective. What I think is really interesting about Leonardo is, of course, he was one of the first people who was using perspective in drawing. But what he draws here is in no sense a real picture. It's obviously an imaginary landscape. But aren't our realities full of imaginary landscapes? Why should we only focus on the real? Or if we're focusing on the real, what is the real? When we get into the cognitive dimensions of our imagination, I think there's no end to the perspectives that we can bring to bear. Now, when I was 17, I had to determine, I actually made it a little bit simplistic before, I had to determine between medicine and music. But one of the reasons I did music was because I could also do philosophy and medicine, philosophy and maths if I was doing music. Whereas medicine, they said you just had to do the modules all the way through. And I was interested in psychiatry, and that was going to take 13 years. So instead I spent 13 years studying music. What I think is really interesting is that if I was 17 today, there's a whole new field which has sort of emerged into popular awareness, which is evidenced by the fact that so many of you are here today, which is obviously the cognitive sciences. This thing about understanding who we are and what we are as human beings has, I agree, got to be the most fascinating and fundamental question that we have. But actually, we need to see it as an amalgam of a whole range of different subjects. They tend to turn up in universities across the whole spectrum, from arts through to the sciences, through the vocational enterprises. But ways in which we connect them, I think, are going to be the fundamental journey for the 21st century. And that the way we see things, I'm now 3 times your age, the way we see things across a lifetime can have radical transformations in perspective. So I think the important thing to understand as we reconnect with nature, as we look at the deeper, longer-term truths of ourselves, is that wondering is in our nature. Thank you.